What is creepiest paranormal story you experience yourself? I used to work in an old building with an office upstairs, often arriving before anyone else. Most mornings, I'd hear the sound of the front door opening and footsteps echoing down the hall. I'd get up to see who it was, but there would be no one there. At first, I thought I was just imagining it, especially since it only seemed to happen when I was deep in thought or focused on something. Whenever I tried to listen for it, the sound was gone. Years later, long after I'd left the building, I was telling someone about those strange experiences. She told me that someone had passed away in the very office I had worked in, dying of natural causes. Other people had also reported hearing footsteps in the morning, as if the man was still arriving for work and walking down the hall to his office. Not long after my mini dachshund passed away from an aneurysm, I was lying in bed one morning, just waking up with the covers pulled over my head. Suddenly, I heard sniffing right by my left ear. I froze, unable to summon the courage to look. Then whatever it was ran up and down the bed a few times, just like she used to when she was excited. I could even feel it jumping off the bed, but there was no sound of it hitting the floor. She used to do that all the time when she was happy, running up and down the bed. I'm sure there's some logical explanation, like maybe I was just losing my mind, but it shook me up for a long time. In high school, I used to go running down our road after school, which was about a mile long if you did one lap. There were 7 houses along the stretch, and in between, there were patches of woods and fields, so I always took my brother with me for safety. Our neighbor's house was right next to ours, just through a small patch of woods. After that, there was one more house before you hit a large stretch of woods and fields, with nothing for a long way until the next house. We had just started our run, and when we reached the 3rd house before entering the wooded area, we saw something move quickly from the field into the woods. It ran on 2 legs, like a person, but it was way too fast to be human. It didn't look like a bear either. The way it moved was all wrong. My brother swears it had antlers, like a buck. We didn't hesitate. We turned around immediately and ran straight home, not daring to leave the house again that day. One night, around 2 a.m., I suddenly woke up for no reason. As I lay there, I started hearing my piano play, and someone was playing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. I sat up and listened, trying to figure out what was going on. Since my door was made of glass, I could see the light was on in the living room, so I thought maybe my dad was up trying to comfort my baby brother. But I didn't hear him crying, and that struck me as odd. The next morning, I asked my family if anyone had been awake, and they all said no. Plus, my dad isn't the type to play the piano at random, especially knowing it would wake someone up. It didn't make any sense. Back in elementary school, I had to talk to a teacher about something after school. I don't remember the exact reason, but it was probably something simple like scheduling a makeup test. The conversation didn't take more than 5 minutes. Afterward, I walked home, but started feeling kind of sick on the way. When I finally got home, my mom was extremely worried because I was an hour late. I hadn't taken any detours, and my house was only a 5-minute walk from school, so it was really strange to me. Even now, I can't explain why I was so much later than usual. A few years ago, I was setting up a baby shower for my sister in this old conference room that had been converted into a sort of hotel on my high school campus. I knew the building's history. Around 1910, some students had died there during a typhoid fever outbreak. After it was renovated, construction workers had complained about power tools turning on by themselves, dangling from their cords, or radios switching stations every morning when they returned. The building is mainly used for meetings, special events, and as a place for alumni and visitors to stay, so it doesn't have staff on site 24/7. I decided to play some music while I decorated to avoid the silence. I started around 10:30 p.m., and things were going smoothly. I kept hearing whispering, but I figured it was just people staying in the building, and I was hearing them through the vents. Then, exactly at midnight, my playlist ended, and I was finishing up the last bit of decorating when I heard 5 distinct notes played on electric piano. I glanced over and saw the piano was unplugged. I immediately noped out of there. The next day, during the shower, I found out that no one had been staying in the building the night before. I haven't gone back into that building by myself since. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, scrolling through my phone, facing my walk-in robe. The dogs were asleep in their beds at the bottom of the robe. Suddenly, they both startled and bolted to my side, tails tucked between their legs. Just after that, a glass bowl fell off the shelf above the closed rails and smashed right on top of their beds. The bowl was ornamental, had been sitting there for months, and was placed well back from the edge. We hadn't moved anything up there in weeks. That night, I slept with the lights on, and to this day, I can't look into that room in the dark without feeling like something's watching me. I was in my teens, sitting on the floor in my room doing homework. For some reason, I was lying on my stomach, probably coloring in a map for history or something. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed some movement on my desk across the room, a quick, sudden shift like something a spider or wasp might make. My desk was my painting station, covered in pots of paint and miniatures. As I focused, I saw one of the miniatures, a heavy metal model of a weird tall mech, an Eldar Wraithlord for those who know, just slide across the desk, moving about a meter before it fell with a sickening thud and the crack of failed glue joints. The desk was flat. There was no way it could have shifted like that on its own. It was the most unnatural, unsettling thing I've ever seen. I just froze, staring at it for a moment, then bolted out of the room as fast as I could. It never happened again, but I remember it clearly to this day, especially because I had to repaint the damn thing. I have several stories like this, but the one that gets told the most is from when I was about 4 years old, and my mom loves to share it with people. I don't have many clear memories from my childhood before I was about 6, likely due to some head trauma. I occasionally get small flashes of memories, and I have to ask family members if they're real or just imagined. One memory that started to surface in high school was of me in a house with floor-to-ceiling windows. I remember talking to a little boy on the other side of the window. The thing is, I don't remember ever living in a house like that. We moved a lot when I was little. So I asked my mom about it. When I did, her eyes got wide and she went quiet. When I was 4, my parents found a house to rent. My mom was pregnant, and with me already in the picture, they wanted more space than an apartment could offer. The house was really nice, with plenty of rooms and those huge floor-to-ceiling windows. We moved in right away. But my mom always felt uneasy there, like she couldn't get comfortable, especially when it was just the two of us. Dad would say, "It's because you're pregnant," and my mom wouldn't say much more. A few days after we moved in, I suddenly had an imaginary friend named Bobby. According to me, he was an older kid, and I could describe him in great detail. Since I was only 4, everyone assumed it was just a phase. Everyone except my mom. She always felt unsettled by Bobby, and there were 2 things that bothered her the most. 1, I only ever played or talked to Bobby when I was next to the really tall windows. She said it was obvious I wasn't talking to myself, but to something or someone else. 2, I would constantly ask for band-aids for Bobby's boo-boos, which I mentioned often when talking about him. A little over a month after we moved in, my mom and I were outside playing when the neighbor came over to chat. The adults started talking about me and kids in general, and at one point, the neighbor mentioned how nice it was to have a family next door again. My mom asked what they meant, and the neighbor explained, "Oh, don't you know? A family lived here about a year ago with their kids. Their son Bobby was outside riding his bike when he got hit by a car and died right on the front lawn. It was so sad." My mom immediately excused herself, picked me up, packed some bags, and drove straight to my grandparents' house, where we stayed until we found an apartment. She refused to go back to the house to pack up anything. To this day, I've never been back. The house is still there in my hometown, and I sometimes wonder if I should drive by when I'm in town, but I can't bring myself to do it. That was my first experience, and it's one that often leads people to ask if there have been more. Yes, there have been more. When I was 17, we got a cat named Sarah Daisy, and she quickly became very attached to me, despite there being 2 brothers, 2 sisters, and my parents all living in the house. At first, it was cute. She followed me everywhere. But then things started to get weird. She began peeing on my pillow while I was sleeping, which I assumed was her way of marking territory. To deal with this, I bought a lock for my door and started locking her out of my room at night. But that didn't work. Somehow, every night, my door would end up unlocked or opened, and I'd wake up to find she had peed on my pillow again. I asked my family if anyone had been messing with the door or unlocking it, but everyone denied it. Things got stranger one day when my younger brother, who was always a bit rough with the animals when they annoyed him, was home alone with me. I heard a little girl's voice, clear as day, coming from the end of the hallway. It sounded unfamiliar, and the voice was calling, "Mikey, help me please. I'm in here and I'm scared. Mikey, help." Naturally, I crept down the hall, cautiously, trying to figure out who was home. The voice came again, now from the bathroom. I opened the door quickly, and the shower was running. Inside, I found Sarah Daisy, soaked and stuck in the bathroom, meowing for help. I dried her off and went to find my brother. I asked him if he had heard the cat crying or calling out, and he just stared at me weirdly and told me to F*** off. A few months later, I was sitting at the computer desk near the stairs that led down to the basement, which my brother had claimed as his room. Suddenly, I heard the same little girl's voice again. "Mikey, help! I'm in the basement. I can't get out. Help me." I heard loud banging noises as my brother scrambled up the stairs, looking like he had seen a ghost. I told him to go back down and let her out, but he flat out refused. "There's no way I'm going back down there with her there," he said. So, I went down myself and found Sarah Daisy locked inside an old, empty refrigerator box, something my brother had apparently done to her, either as punishment or just for fun. After that, my brother started to believe me about Sarah Daisy being able to talk, or at least make herself heard. We finally told our parents that night, but of course, they didn't believe us. If it had been the age of smartphones back then, we would have recorded the whole thing to prove it. But as it was, we were left with only the bizarre memories of Sarah Daisy and her strange, unexplainable talking. When I was in 1st or 2nd grade, I had to leave school early for a dentist appointment. My grandma picked me up a bit earlier than usual that day because, in addition to the appointment, we also needed to do a few things like getting gas for the car and stopping by my aunt's house to let her dog, Daisy, out. We made the stop at the gas station to fuel up, and while my grandma went in to pay, her old Nokia phone started ringing. It was one of those classic brick phones that played Fur Elise as its ringtone. It was my aunt calling from her house, except she was supposed to be out of town on a business trip. My grandma answered, asking, "Hello?" On the other end, there was no response at first, but we could hear sounds as if someone was playing with Daisy, calling her name, and saying things like, "Good girl," the usual pet talk. My grandma asked again, "Hello?" And this time, she heard a voice respond. It sounded like my aunt's voice, but just said, "Hello," before the line went dead. I looked up at her, wide-eyed, and said, "Grandma, what's going on?" Without saying much, she grabbed my hand and hurried us out of the gas station. We rushed over to my aunt's house, expecting to find her there, but the place was empty, just as we thought. The phone was still on the wall, and Daisy was ecstatic to see us, as if she'd been waiting all day to be let out, which she should have been. Strangely, the radio that my aunt always left on for Daisy's background noise was turned off, so we switched it back on before leaving. Later that evening, my grandma called my aunt, knowing she'd be back from her trip by then. She asked how in the world she had managed to call from her house that afternoon. My aunt was confused and said she hadn't called at all. In fact, she had tried to call us, but from 2 cities over, from where she was on her business trip, just to make sure we hadn't forgotten to let Daisy out. She had no idea who or would have been playing with her dog or who said hello, because from her end, the call hadn't gone through. To this day, my grandma and I still have no idea what happened. It's one of those mysteries that still gives me chills when I think about it. In college, I worked with a guy named Kyle who had a pretty distinct look, half his head shaved with a biomech tattoo on his scalp. One day, I got a call at work that my uncle had collapsed suddenly and was probably going to pass soon. Kyle offered to take my morning shift the next day so I could go say goodbye to my uncle. The next day, I spent the whole time at the hospital with my family. At one point, my uncle had to go for some tests, so we decided to grab lunch. We ended up across the street at a Panera Bread, and when I walked in, I froze sitting there was Kyle. My heart dropped into my stomach because if he hadn't covered my shift, we were both going to get in trouble. The shift change hadn't been approved by a manager or anything, so I rushed over to him, completely panicked. He looked up at me, blinked in confusion, and greeted me by name, but he was acting really out of it, like he had just woken up or was high. I asked him why he wasn't covering my shift, and he answered, "I am covering your shift." Thinking there was a miscommunication, I said, "The shift started 3 hours ago. It was the morning shift," and he repeated, "I am covering your shift." His voice was still slow, and he sounded totally dazed. I couldn't use my phone in the ICU, so I asked my aunt if I could borrow hers to call work. While I was doing that, I saw Kyle get up and wander out of the restaurant. Confused, I made the call to work, and to my shock, Kyle was the one to answer the phone in his normal voice. He'd been there the whole time. By the time I finished my call, Kyle was nowhere to be seen. When I thought about it later, nothing about it made sense. Kyle lived an hour away, and he wasn't the type to hang out at Panera. He didn't even have any food with him, just sitting there in a daze. When I told Kyle about the strange encounter, he casually mentioned that people had seen him in places he wasn't or couldn't be, and some of the stories he shared with me gave me chills. To this day, I can't explain what happened. It still creeps me out. When I was around 12, I was visiting my sister's apartment. One evening, I was out on the balcony with her then husband when suddenly, a bright purple light flashed across the sky. For about 3 seconds, everything around us turned a deep purple. We were both frozen, staring at the strange glow, but after it faded, everything went back to normal. We never figured out what caused it. One night, my mom, sister, and I were in the living room watching TV while it snowed on and off outside. Suddenly, we heard a thump from the other room, like someone had opened and closed, or maybe even bumped into the storm door on the porch. But when we checked, there were no marks in the snow to explain it. No signs of anything hitting the door. Even if a bird had flown into it, you'd expect it to fall, stunned, before flying off. My grandma had recently passed, and my mom casually said, "She's still learning how to reach us. She's clumsy." I didn't think much of it at the time, just shrugged it off with a laugh. My half-brother, stepbrother, several friends, and I have all experienced strange, unsettling things at a beach in NSW. The entire point is sacred Aboriginal land and burial grounds, with a history spanning about 27,000 years. At night, on the beaches, you'll often find yourself tripping out, seeing dark shadows moving in and out of the dunes. It's deeply unsettling, and the atmosphere feels charged with intense emotion. You never feel truly alone. At first, I chalked it all up to paranoia, but after seeing things with my own eyes, I'm not so sure anymore. Now, I won't walk through that bush at night. Not that I'm afraid of the dark. I've walked through plenty of forests. But there's this overwhelming feeling that I don't belong there, like I'm being watched. I can't explain it, but I'll never go back. One time, in the house where I grew up, I heard my name called clear as day from an empty room. I was alone at the time, and the voice was unmistakable. It wasn't like anything else I'd ever heard, just my name, loud and distinct. It sent a chill down my spine. One evening, when I was about 15 or 16, I was home alone. It was dark and rainy outside, the kind of night that makes everything feel a little off. I wandered into the kitchen, hoping to find a snack, but the only thing left was a small box of raisins. When I was young, I stayed overnight at my father's workplace while he worked the night shift. I slept on a sofa near a window that faced a large tree outside. In the middle of the night, I woke up to see a silhouette of a woman in white perched on the tree. Confused, I pointed at it and asked my dad what it was. He quickly hushed me, telling me it was nothing, so I brushed it off and went back to sleep. Years later, I overheard my dad talking to my uncle about the incident. To my surprise, he revealed that there was, in fact, a spirit that had been living in that tree. I had to work overtime to meet a project deadline and ended up being the only one left in the office. After a few hours, the building security guard knocked on our office door and mentioned that he had seen me walking on the third floor during his patrol. He said, "I'm sure I saw you clearly, your face and the clothes you were wearing. We weren't allowed to be on other floors, so I was irritated because I was trying to finish my work as quickly as possible and didn't have time for a conversation." However, I politely told him I hadn't left the office and started my overtime shift. The next day, I asked my boss if we could check the CCTV footage from that night to clear my name in case anything went missing from the third floor. The CCTV inside our office and the hallway cameras were separate, so we figured it would help. The security team told us they reviewed their recordings but didn't see me go to the third floor at all. After that, I never agreed to work overtime again. Back when I was in university, I had an unfortunate accident and ended up breaking a bone in my left foot and suffering a concussion after falling into a ditch near my hostel. At first, I didn't realize I'd broken anything, but after a few days, my foot became visibly swollen and unbearably painful. I couldn't walk at all, and even had to crawl to the bathroom. It was that bad. Since my roommates were all unavailable, I had to call my parents, and they came to pick me up the next day. Here's where the paranormal part kicks in. Where I'm from, we mix both superstitions and science. My father, thinking that taking me to a hospital would mean I'd be on crutches for weeks, decided to take me to see a traditional healer instead, believing the healing process would be faster. He'd heard that this healer had friends who helped with the healing, and that it would be cheaper and quicker. So we went to see the healer. He spent about 15 minutes massaging my swollen foot, and although it was excruciating, he then rubbed it with camphor and kaffir lime. Before I left, he told me to go to bed by 10 p.m. or else his friend wouldn't be able to help me heal. As a typical university student, I didn't take him seriously and stayed up later than 10 p.m. thinking nothing would happen. However, the next day, I decided to give it another shot and went to bed by 10 p.m., determined to follow his instructions. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sensation of hands massaging my left foot. I briefly opened my eyes and swear I saw a dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, gently massaging my foot. I couldn't move. My body was completely immobilized. I closed my eyes again, but I could still feel the hands on my foot. To make the situation even more eerie, my roommates weren't there, so I was completely alone in my room. The next morning, I woke up, and to my absolute shock, I could walk normally. I got up, walked to the cafe for breakfast, took a shower, and just to test it out, I decided to go for a run. I ran with a completely healed foot. It was as if the injury never happened. To this day, I can't explain what exactly happened that night, but I've never forgotten it. I don't usually believe in ghosts, but this experience still baffles me to this day. It's something I've never been able to explain. I was 19 at the time, and one day my friend and I decided to walk to his house, which was about a mile away from mine. To get there, we had to cross a busy high street, and it was around 11 a.m. on a fairly busy morning. We decided to take a shortcut through some church property, which led us through its car park. It was broad daylight, the area was bustling, and we were just casually talking about nothing in particular as we walked through. As we passed through the car park, for some reason, both of us stopped at the exact same moment and turned around to look behind us. After a few seconds, we turned back and continued walking. But then we both stopped again, looked at each other, and said, almost simultaneously, "Did you just see what I saw?" I immediately said that I'd tell him what I saw, and he could tell me if it matched up with what he saw. I told him I saw a classic, almost cliche ghost figure, an outline of a woman, maybe in her 30s, wearing a traditional dress from over 100 years ago. The figure was faint, hazy, and only mildly transparent, almost like something you'd see in a Hollywood movie. I didn't catch much detail, but it was enough to leave me feeling uneasy. He looked a little shaken and described exactly the same thing. A woman in old-fashioned clothing, slightly transparent. I asked him to confirm where exactly he had seen it, just to make sure we were talking about the same spot. He walked over to the exact spot where I'd seen the figure. It was about 12 to 15 yards away to our right. We were in broad daylight in a fairly busy area, with cars moving around and people going about their business. It was 11 a.m., and my friend was never the type to exaggerate or make things up. He wasn't a drama queen. Even now, 20 years later, we occasionally talk about it, and neither of us has been able to make sense of what happened that day. This is something that happened to me, my brother-in-law, and my aunt in different parts of the house. It all started one night when I was sleeping in my room. I woke up in the middle of the night and saw a woman in a white dress with long, black hair standing beside my bed. She asked me, "Are you cold?" I just nodded, thinking it was my mom or one of my sisters checking on me. She then tucked me in, and I went back to sleep without giving it much thought. The next day, I asked everyone in the house if anyone had come into my room to tuck me in, but they all said no. When I mentioned it to my aunt, she told me that something similar had happened to her. She had also seen a woman in a white dress, but this time, she realized she didn't know the woman. The strange part was that the woman had covered her face when she noticed my aunt looking at her. Around the same time, my sister had her own unsettling experiences. She heard a man's voice whispering right next to her ear as she was about to fall asleep. Every day, we could hear footsteps running around the house, things being moved, and general activity that didn't seem to have a clear source. The most terrifying experience came one day when my sister, her friend, and my brother-in-law were all in the house together. They all saw a small, dwarf-like figure running through the backyard. After these strange events, my mom contacted a woman who claimed to have the ability to communicate with spirits. The woman didn't know us at all, but when she started talking to my mom, she asked her things like her name, age, and how many children she had. When my mom told her she had 3 kids, the woman shocked her by saying, "No, you have 4 children. The oldest one died when you were 3 months pregnant." My mom was stunned, and the woman continued by describing our house in detail, even though she had never been there. Eventually, the woman came to our house. She told us that there were 3 portals in the house, one of which was in my room, which always seemed to be unnaturally cold. She explained that 2 spirits, a man and a woman, had been drawn to the house because they saw me playing alone and decided to come and interact with me. The woman performed some kind of ritual to cleanse the house. After she finished, everything stopped. The strange noises ceased. We never saw or heard anything again, and my room was never cold again. The house felt peaceful, and the unsettling presence seemed to disappear completely. I decided to visit the Queen Mary for one of their haunted tours. The ship is old and a popular tourist attraction, so I was fully expecting to be on deck and experience absolutely nothing. After all, many places tend to exaggerate their haunted histories to attract more visitors. One of the final stops on the tour was the pool. It had been drained because by law, they couldn't fill it back up. Still, they claim that people occasionally see wet footprints on the pool deck, and that a little girl is known to grab your hand in that area. The tour guide wrapped up their spiel and moved on to the next part of the tour. But then, something strange happened. I felt 3 of my fingers as though they were being gently held together by a child's hand, and it felt like I was being pulled away from the pool. At first, I thought it was one of the kids on the tour playing around. There were 3 kids with their families in the group. But after a moment, I realized I could see all 3 of them, and none of them were near me. In fact, the closest person to me was at least 40 feet away. What really made this experience unsettling for me was that only a very small handful of people know that I can't swim and would never want to go anywhere near that pool. It made me wonder if the ghost somehow knew that. This happened about 10 years ago when some friends and I went camping in my stepmom's property in a small lake town, a place mostly used for summer homes. One day, we decided to hike the local trails and came across an unmarked cemetery. A few of us were into paranormal stuff, so we decided to check it out. Afterward, we continued up the trail. A little further along, we reached a gravel clearing that was gated off. In the center of the clearing was a strange triangular structure, about 8 feet high, 5 feet wide, and 3 feet thick. It looked like someone had cut off the top of a church and placed it right there in the middle of the circle. We thought it was odd, but cool, so we decided to sneak in. On the front of the structure was a small door, secured with a massive padlock, one of the biggest I've ever seen, about the size of a clenched fist. Naturally, being the most skeptical, but also the most intrigued, I went up to the door. But as I got closer, a wave of panic hit me, and I felt violently ill. I suddenly became dizzy, my vision blurred, and I was overcome with nausea, chills, and cold sweats. It was like the worst migraine I've ever had, plus a full-blown panic attack. I almost collapsed when one of my friends grabbed me and pulled me away from the structure, getting me back out of the gated area. As soon as I was outside, all of those symptoms stopped instantly. I didn't dare go back near it, and neither did any of my friends. Over the years, I've visited several places looking into paranormal activity, including living in a house for 4 years where strange things happened regularly. But nothing I've ever experienced compared to this. I tried searching online to find any information about that strange structure, but I couldn't find anything. That one still baffles me. It's hands down the creepiest thing I've ever experienced. Edit. Oh, and here's a close second. When I was about 9, my family moved to a tiny town in New Hampshire. My mom's boyfriend lived at the end of a mile-long dirt road with only one neighbor. He had a large backyard with a huge willow tree right in the center. One night, before we went back to our apartment, my mom and her boyfriend got into a fight. On the way out, he decided to turn off all the yard lights to be petty, so we had to walk back to the car in the dark. This was before cell phones, and we didn't have a flashlight, so we made our way slowly. About halfway to the car, we heard a loud howl from the yard, almost like it ended with a human-like laugh. It was followed by a few more, overlapping, each ending with that eerie laugh. My mom and I ran to the car, and her boyfriend turned on the headlights. But the lights didn't reach all the way to the willow tree. We saw several spots near the tree that reflected like eyes, but when my mom turned the headlights directly on the tree, there was nothing there. If it had been just me, I might have written it off as an overactive imagination, but my mom, her boyfriend, and his 2 kids all heard and saw it too. We never figured out what it was. Some friends later suggested it could have been coy dogs, but I'll never really know. What's weird is how quickly it disappeared. It felt like it was there and then gone. Edit 2. Oh, and I just remembered another one. Back when I was in middle school, I had to go to church for confirmation and attend youth group on Fridays. One night, the person in charge of watching us disappeared, so a group of us decided to explore the large, empty church at night. Smart idea, right? We were about 12. We ended up in an upstairs room used for Sunday school. Out of the window, we saw 2 red lights that looked like eyes, surrounded by a shadowy figure that seemed to wear a cloak. Looking back, it's clear we were probably just imagining it. But one of my friends got scared and ran to the room across from us. As we were trying to figure out what we'd seen, that friend came back over and said they'd seen something outside. So we all piled into the other room to see what they'd seen. The window overlooked the church's garden area with a little bridge and a river flowing through it. We all looked out, and then, boom, we saw a large wolf sprint across the garden. At that exact moment, the door to the room opened, and our supervisor, who was supposed to be keeping an eye on us, walked in. Here's the weird part. There was a glass on a table in the middle of the room. When the door opened, the glass shattered. It wasn't like it fell over. It looked like someone had gripped it tightly enough to break it. We were all huddled around the window. The table was halfway across the room, and the door was off to the side. So there was no way the supervisor could have been the one to break it. We got in trouble for breaking the glass, but the supervisor seemed more concerned about the wolf thing we saw. There's a weird bit of church history tied to that place that connects to a famous, easily Googled murder case, but I'm not going to get into that. It's funny, though, how many strange experiences I've had over the years. Some I can explain, and some I'm still trying to figure out. When I was about 9, my grandfather passed away at home. He'd been battling cancer for some time, and after spending a few weeks in a hospital, he asked to come home to pass peacefully. They granted his wish, and after about 3 days, he was gone. My grandmother stayed in the house after his death, and every Sunday, her kids and us grandkids would gather there for lunch. It was a tradition we had kept even after my grandfather passed away, just as we had when he was still around. One Sunday, I must have been in my mid-teens at the time, I was doing dishes in the kitchen, gazing out the window of my grandmother's backyard. I looked toward the far corner where my grandfather's blueberry bushes were planted. Suddenly, I froze. Standing there in the yard was my grandfather, and walking beside him was Mitzi, the dog my aunt had buried in the yard a few years earlier. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Of all the pets my grandmother had, Mitzi was the one who had always been closest to my grandfather. She'd go on walks with us, stay by his side, and was always with him. I watched as they slowly walked from the bushes toward the house, and just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished. One blink, and they were gone. I stood there, completely overwhelmed with emotion. I burst into tears, trying to explain to my family that my grandfather was out in the yard with Mitzi. But no one else had seen them. I'll never forget that moment, that strange, inexplicable encounter. I don't know what it was, but I can still feel the weight of it today. When I was about 11 or 12, I had one of the many strange experiences growing up. I was sitting in the living room of my grandpa's house, watching TV with my aunt and uncle. The doorway leading out of the living room had those old 70s style beaded curtains hanging down, if you know the kind I'm talking about. We were all sitting there in silence, with just the TV on, when I suddenly felt my uncle tense up next to me on the couch. I turned to see what was going on and noticed he was staring intently at the beaded curtain. Curious, I looked too, and that's when I saw it. A single bead from the curtain was swinging rapidly back and forth like someone had just rushed through it. But the rest of the beads remained completely still. I watched in shock for only a few seconds, and then my uncle whispered urgently, "Stiphen's aunt, look." The moment she turned her head to look at the beads, the swinging bead stopped instantly and settled in line with the others, as if nothing had happened. My aunt never saw what we saw, but my uncle and I both witnessed it, and it's something we still talk about when we visit Grandpa's house. My little sister had a habit of sleepwalking. One night, around 1 a.m, I heard her leave her room and walk down the hallway. Concerned, I decided to follow her to make sure she was okay. But when I went out into the hallway, she was gone. I searched all the rooms upstairs, but she wasn't anywhere. So, I went downstairs, thinking she might be outside our parents' door, but she wasn't there either, and all the lights were off. I continued my search in the basement and finally found her standing in the dark bathroom, right in front of the mirror. I called her name softly. She calmly turned around, looked directly at me, and then burst into tears. I took her back upstairs, calmed her down, and tucked her back into bed. Afterwards, and I don't know why, this protective big brother instinct just kicked in. It sounds cheesy, but I suddenly felt fiercely protective. I turned and looked down the hallway, and in a very stern voice, I said, "Stay away from my sister." I have no idea why I said it or who I thought I was talking to. But I remember clearly that when I turned back around to go to my room, I felt a cold whisper brush past me, and my skin crawled. Every hair on my body stood on end. I'm not a believer in anything supernatural. I'm an atheist, all that. I definitely don't believe in an afterlife. But I have never been more terrified in my life than I was that night. Even just typing this out is making me feel uneasy. The hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of keys were the soundtrack of my childhood. Growing up with a computer programmer for a dad in our house was a haven for beige towers and tangled cords, a relative novelty in those pre-ubiquitous PC days. I'd often be lost in a pixelated adventure in one room, while down the hall, the steady clatter from his home office marked his progress through lines of code. Then the silence came. The sudden, heavy quiet after he passed away settled over the house, a stark contrast to the constant digital murmur we were used to. One night, weeks later, I was in my usual spot, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes when I heard it. A distinct typing sound coming from his office down the hall. My fingers froze above the keyboard. I held my breath, listening. The tapping stopped. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the old house settling, and resumed what I was doing. Almost immediately, the faint but unmistakable sound of keys clicking began again. This went on for what felt like an eternity, maybe 10 minutes of bizarre call-in response between my activity and the phantom typing. Finally, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach, I forced myself to get up. The hallway stretched before me, silent and dark. I flicked on the office light. The room was still, the computer screen dark and lifeless. No one was there. Later, I mentioned the strange occurrence to my mother. A shadow crossed her face. "You know," she said quietly, "sometimes I'll leave the house during the day, and when I come back in the evening, the living room lamps are on. I'm always so sure I turned them off." I must have been 10 or 11, and my brother was a year or two older. We were inside, probably engrossed in some made-up game, when a flash of blonde caught my eye through the living room window. A little girl, kind of chubby with long, light hair that swung as she moved, was playing on our tire swing in the front yard. Now, we knew all the kids in the neighborhood pretty well, and this girl was a stranger. Curiosity piqued, we ran outside to see who she was. As soon as we stepped onto the porch, she looked right at us, hopped off the tire, and bolted towards our backyard. My brother and I exchanged a quick glance and took off after her. We rounded the side of the house, expecting to see her still running, but when we reached the backyard, she was gone. That's when it got really weird. Our backyard was completely enclosed by a pretty tall wooden fence. Even if she could have climbed over it, the property directly behind us was just an empty lot, completely wild with dense, thorny blackberry bushes. There was nowhere for her to have gone that quickly, or really at all, without getting completely tangled and scratched. I don't know if it was something supernatural, but that little blonde girl who vanished in a thin air in our fenced-in backyard has always stuck with me. The winter of 2011 holds the memory of the most unsettling, possibly paranormal, event I've ever experienced. I was home from college for winter break, enjoying time with my family. My aunt and uncle lived about a half-hour drive outside of town with their 3 kids. Abby, who was a few years younger than me, and 2 much younger ones, Kaylin, just 2 years old, and Terrence, who was 5. One night, my aunt and uncle were out of town, leaving Abby in charge. Around 1:30 a.m., my mom's phone rang. It was Abby, and she sounded panicked. Kaylin had woken up crying several times, claiming a monster had scratched her. Abby had initially dismissed it as bad dreams, but the last time, when she lifted Kaylin's pajamas, there were angry red scratch marks on her side, far too large to have been made by a 2-year-old's small hands. They had no pets, and Terrence had been downstairs with Abby the entire evening. My mom, understandably concerned, sent my brothers and me to their house to check on everyone. When we arrived, we found Abby, Kaylin, and Terrence huddled together in the brightly lit living room. I gently examined Kaylin's side and saw the distinct scratches Abby had described. My brothers and I quickly secured all the doors and windows before splitting up to search the entire house. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of place. We decided it was best to keep everyone together in the living room for the rest of the night, not wanting to wake the already sleeping younger kids for a late-night car ride. Just as a fragile sense of calm settled, my cell phone rang. We all jumped, thinking it was another family member calling for an update. I looked at the screen and felt a jolt of pure terror mixed with utter confusion. The caller ID showed the call was coming from the house itself. The thing is, there were 2 landlines in the house. One was right there in the living room with us, and the other was upstairs in the attic that had been converted into Abby's bedroom. Needless to say, we didn't waste another second. We got out of that house as fast as humanly possible. Our house always had this feeling. Not necessarily scary, just a constant sense of another presence, like someone was just out of sight. I'd always joked it was a ghost. One night, I was in bed, my cat curled up beside me. That familiar feeling washed over me, so I glanced around the room. I could have sworn I saw a flicker of shadow move near the doorway. I told myself it was just the dim light playing tricks and went back to watching TV. But then I caught movement again in my peripheral vision. And a really weird thing, my cat noticed it too. His head snapped around so fast, it was like it was on a swivel. Then he started meowing. Now, this is important. My cat never meows. Like ever. He's the quietest cat I've ever known. He suddenly jumped up, his eyes fixed on the same spot I'd seen the movement, and then he darted forward. I swear, on everything I hold dear, I saw this almost see-through, shimmering form drift out of my room, and my normally silent cat took off after like a rocket. Definitely wasn't the weed. It was probably around midnight, maybe even later. I was 12 or 13, and 2 of my friends were having a sleepover. My brother and parents were sound asleep in their rooms. We were in the living room, and the way our house was set up, anyone moving around or trying to sneak up on us would have been impossible to miss. We were just being typical goofy kids, talking and laughing, when suddenly we all heard it. Clear as a bell, coming from the basement, was the sound of a young girl humming. It wasn't faint or distant, it was loud and right there. The three of us froze, our eyes locking in wide-eyed terror. In the next instant, we were scrambling, practically climbing over each other to bolt up the stairs and into my bedroom. I never even mentioned it to my parents or brother, and I haven't heard that humming since. Our basement always gave me the creeps. It felt dark and heavy, and whenever I had to go down there, I was incredibly uncomfortable, always feeling like I was being watched. That house, it was the last one my parents lived in together before they divorced, and there was definitely a lot of negative energy hanging in the air. I remember when my mom's friend was helping her move out years later, he commented on it too. He said there was something dark in that house, a presence you could feel the moment you walked in. Growing up, a chapter of my childhood was spent in the north of England before my parents' jobs brought us back to Warwick. We lived in a small town, and just a street over from ours, backing onto the local park, stood a line of dilapidated Victorian cottages. There were 4 of them in total, 3 still standing in a state of decay, the 4th a fire-ravaged shell. A simple wire fence and an overgrown hedge were all that separated them from the edge of the park. Local lore, amongst both kids and a few adults, whispered the tale of one of the cottages having been home to a family who had lost their father in the First World War, only for the remaining members to succumb to the Spanish flu around 1919. Occasionally, locals would brave entering this particular cottage, and even for someone as skeptical of ghosts and the supernatural as I've always been, it genuinely felt like a haunted house. There was a palpable chill inside, regardless of the weather outside. A heavy, unhappy atmosphere seemed to cling to the very air, a distinct shift the moment you crossed the threshold. Inside, you'd hear unsettling knocks and scratches, which I, ever the pragmatist, always attributed to rats. The interior was a mess of dirt, graffiti, and discarded rubbish. More disturbingly, there were scattered needles and what looked like old bloodstains. We also found strange books filled with scribbled drawings and text in what looked like Greek or Cyrillic characters. 2 of my friends were absolutely convinced that the family from the rumors was buried beneath the floorboards of the back room. Several people even claimed that if you pressed your ear to the bare concrete in that room, you could hear faint knocking or scratching sounds coming from below. Probably just a load of nonsense and a creepy old building playing tricks on our imaginations, but it was undeniably unsettling. Back in elementary school, our teacher had a repertoire of spooky tales she'd share whenever we begged her for one. I remember one particularly rainy day, the kind where the sky was a solid sheet of gray. The classroom lights hummed, and the sound of rain against the windows created a cozy, slightly eerie atmosphere as she began another scary story. Suddenly, in the middle of her narration, a white raincoat seemed to fly into the classroom. It whipped past our teacher, a blur of white against the dreary backdrop. I remember the collective shriek that erupted from all of us kids. But our teacher, she just laughed. A hearty, unbothered laugh. "Oh, don't be scared. she said, completely unfazed. That old thing? It always does that when the wind picks up. My life seems to have been punctuated by moments that tiptoe the line between the explainable and the deeply unsettling, starting all the way back when I was just 5 years old. One of my earliest memories is tied to a heavy, sorrowful time. My mom, dad, brother, and I were at the hospital with my grandfather. It was one of those nights where the family gathers to say their final goodbyes. Later, as the night deepened and some family drama brewed, a story for another time, my mom decided to take my brother and me home. She stopped at the Walmart right next to the hospital, bought us coloring books, a detail that inexplicably sticks in my mind, and we started our drive. I remember sitting in the front seat, absorbed in my coloring book under the soft glow of the dashboard and radio. I glanced at the clock. It read 10:48. An inexplicable urgency washed over me, and I told my mom we needed to go back to the hospital. She said no, we were halfway home, and we weren't turning around. I pleaded, a knot of anxiety tightening in my small chest, but she insisted and took us home. We'd been there maybe 10 minutes when my dad called, his voice thick with grief, to tell my mom that my grandfather had passed away roughly 20 minutes before, right around the time I had been so insistent on returning. It's a story my mom still recounts to this day, a shiver in her voice. The house we lived in during my childhood wasn't old, but it was one of those small, cheaply constructed FHA homes. At the end of the hallway, there was this large, almost floor-to-ceiling vent for central heat and air, but it had never worked while we lived there. My brother would often tell us that when he was home alone, he sometimes heard the distinct sound of bells coming from inside it. We never believed him. Then one day I was home alone, chatting on the phone with my best friend, sitting in the living room, when I heard it myself. It sounded exactly like sleigh bells, a clear, jingling sound emanating from the vent. My friend asked what I was playing with. I said nothing. She didn't believe me and got annoyed, complaining that the bells are annoying. Same house. This is something my mom always dismissed. When I was a kid, I would sometimes see a shadow in the upper corner where the walls met the ceiling. The best way I could describe it to my mom was that it looked like Count Dracula, a dark shape with a sharp, steep widow's peak. I don't remember the exact details now, only that it scared me every time I saw it. And it was always the same. Shortly after I saw that shadow, someone would get hurt. The clearest instance I recall was seeing it, and then, not long after, my mom accidentally stapling her finger. Nothing serious, but an injury nonetheless. Same house, well, same area as this happened outside. I was a teenager, and my best friend was having a sleepover. We were sitting in the yard late at night, looking up at the stars and talking about the important things teenage girls talk about. We lived in the country then, and across the road from our house was a sweet potato field, then a cotton field, and then a few other houses. On the other side of the sweet potato field was another house. On either side of our house were woods. The night was bright with the moon and stars, so we could see pretty well. Suddenly my friend whispered, "Chill. Do you hear that?" I listened, and I did. It sounded like boots on pavement. We were about to head back inside, thinking maybe someone was walking down the road, highly unusual at that hour in that area, but before we could move, something came into view. It was strange to hear the footsteps so clearly because of the distance from the road to where we were. Unless someone was deliberately stomping, we shouldn't have heard it so distinctly. What we saw was a man wearing overalls, a white shirt underneath, boots, and a red hat. He was just strolling along, like he didn't have a care in the world. I froze, a strange flicker of recognition in my mind, like I should know this man. But the thought never fully formed because as he passed our mailbox and turned his head to look at us, we could see the mailbox through him. My friend screamed and ran back into the house, locking me outside in her panic. The next day, I told my mom, and she said it sounded like Mr. Done. Mr. Dan had lived in the house next to the field and worked those fields for years before he passed away. New house. We moved into town, and right away, something fell off about this house. I could feel it, a pervasive unease, but I could never quite put my finger on what it was. It seemed concentrated in the back of the house. Something always felt unpleasant back there. To make a long story short, one night I saw a shadow in the back spare bedroom. It was tall and darker than dark, if that makes sense. I don't know how I managed it, but I moved so fast that the next thing I knew, I was in the front bedroom. It was awful because the only bathroom I could use at night without waking anyone was in the back of the house, and I always felt like I was being watched back there in the dark. Same house, same bedroom. My cat, for some reason, loved that back spare bedroom. She'd been a feral kitten, and although she mostly got over it, she was always more antisocial than most cats, preferring to be alone back there. I kept her litter box in that room to keep the dogs out of it. The door was an old, heavy wooden one, hung loosely on its hinges, and she quickly learned that to be let out, she had to bump against it. Several times, the door would bump, but she wouldn't even be in the room. And look, even with everything I'd experienced, my first thought wasn't ghost. I figured it was probably just a draft making the door shake. But one night I was sitting in my computer in my room, and from the back of the house, I heard a rapid series of loud bumps. B-U-M-P, 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 B-U-M-P. It was a calm night, and even if there was a draft, there was no way it could have rattled the door with that kind of force. I froze, my eyes darting to my bed, where I saw my cat curled up, sound asleep. So it wasn't her. I cautiously eased out into the living room and peered down the hallway. The door to the spare bedroom was shaking violently on its hinges, as if someone had grabbed the knob and was jerking it hard against the latch. It scared me so badly that my first thought wasn't ghost, but intruder. I grabbed the phone and ran outside. Our neighbor, who was also our landlord, happened to be on his porch, and I had him come over and check. There was nothing there. No sign of forced entry, no sign anyone had been in the room at all. I told my dad about it, and he thought I was exaggerating, as did my landlord. Then, one afternoon, I went out to get dinner, and when I got home, my dad said, "I didn't believe you about that door." I really didn't. I do now. It did the same thing with me. Same house. I once walked out onto the back porch, and something caught my eye in the woods. There was something big and milky pale moving among the trees. The way its flesh looked made me think of a horse, but it wasn't a horse. There are no horses in that small patch of woods in the middle of town, nestled between neighborhoods. Again, same house. I was in the middle bathroom one night, getting ready to go out with friends, and for a split second, I saw the most terrifying image of a face over my shoulder in the mirror. That one, I've always tried to explain away as my eyes playing tricks on me, a lingering imprint after staring at my own face for too long, creating a distorted, hovering image. Same house. I was tapped on the shoulder one night in the kitchen. There was no one behind me. There were many other smaller, less dramatic incidents in that house. There's not a doubt in my mind that that house was haunted. Nearly 2 years ago, we moved into a new house. Well, not new, it was built in the 40s. But I can say with immense relief that not a single odd or creepy thing has happened here. I have several other unsettling stories from my life, but I feel like I've already written a novel. This is just one of many strange things that have happened to me. I was at my friend Liz's house for a sleepover, and I was crashed out on the floor. She had this huge, gentle golden lab, and in the middle of the night, he lumbered over to where I was sleeping. He put his big face right down over mine, and I swear, clear as day, he spoke. "Who is this?" he rumbled. A little startled, I replied, "It's me, Dakota. It's Liz's friend." And he just said, "Okay," and then turned around and went back to his own dog bed. The next day, he acted like nothing unusual had happened at all, just your typical happy-go-lucky lab. It was so bizarre. This story comes directly from my brother-in-law, Uriel, and it happened in Mexico. His family owned a house on a street corner. Because his parents worked constantly, they hired a young housekeeper and nanny to help with chores and look after Uriel. She was around 12 years old when she started working for them. Uriel said everything was fine at first. She did all her tasks diligently. The house was quite large, so it was impressive how well she managed all the cleaning at such a young age. A prominent feature of the house was a grand staircase leading to the second floor. At the top of the stairs, the first thing you saw was a very large Victorian mirror, a recent gift to his parents from some friends. The family began to notice that the young girl would frequently glance at this mirror. These glances became more intense, escalating into long, fixed stares. She would stand in front of it for hours at a time, completely neglecting her chores. She wouldn't speak to anyone or do anything else but stare into the mirror. Understandably, Uriel's family grew very concerned and contacted her own family. When her family came to take her home, they couldn't pull her away from the mirror. She seemed to be in a trance-like state, completely unresponsive. They took her to the local brujo, or witch doctor, who told them that something inside the mirror had taken her, leaving only her physical body behind. She was in a vegetative state. The strange ordeal finally ended when Uriel's family decided to have the mirror stored in the basement. During the move, one of the movers accidentally stepped on the mirror and it shattered. Just minutes later, the girl's family called Uriel's family with devastating news. The girl had started convulsing and had passed away. I'm not entirely sure if this qualifies, but when my sister was little, she suddenly became adamant that a family of ghosts resided in the house right next to ours. No amount of reasoning or persuasion could change her mind. What was particularly odd was that she wasn't scared of them at all, even though she was easily frightened by ghost stories and other situations. She spoke about these spectral neighbors with the same casualness you'd used to talk about the living people next door. She described them in detail, recount conversations she'd had with them, the whole 9 yards. It got to the point where her unwavering certainty started to creep me out. There was just something so unsettling about the way she was acting. Eventually, the whole ghost family thing just stopped, and I completely forgot about it until a couple of weeks ago when something triggered the memory. I brought it up with her, and she had absolutely no recollection of any of it. This was strange because she was definitely old enough at the time to remember other events happening in our lives. Looking back on the whole episode now, it definitely has this kind of eerie, inexplicable feel to it. There I was, all of 20 years old, thoroughly engrossed in a SpongeBob marathon in my downstairs living room. Suddenly, I heard distinct footsteps overhead on the second floor, followed by the definite sound of the master bedroom door closing with a light slam. My male relatives aren't exactly known for their gentle movements, so my initial thought was, okay, someone's home. Back to Bikini Bottom it was. Except a cold wave of realization washed over me. I was completely alone. My family was out of town, and the dogs weren't allowed inside the house. I cranked up the volume on the TV and tried to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. A few months later, I had a friend house sitting for me. He experienced something eerily similar. He was downstairs watching TV when he heard heavy stomping coming from the upstairs hallway. But this time, the stomping was accompanied by the dragging sound of heavy chains and something else being pulled along the floor, culminating in a door slamming shut. He quickly fed my dogs and, understandably, got out of there. He only agreed to come back to feed them during daylight hours after that. When I was little, I spent a day at my two cousins' house while our moms were out running errands. One cousin was my age, my usual playmate, and the other was 18 and in charge of us. They lived way out in the country in a very old plantation home. There were no neighbors for miles, and they owned a huge amount of land. Their driveway was so long, about half a mile, that you felt completely isolated at their house. My younger cousin and I were sitting at the kitchen table, happily munching on cereal, while my older cousin, Lucy, stood at the counter washing dishes. Above the sink was a window that looked out onto the long driveway. Suddenly, we clearly heard a woman's voice loudly call out, "Lucy." At the same time, we heard a car horn honk. We immediately assumed it was our moms arriving, so my younger cousin and I took off, giggling, to hide from them because we weren't finished playing and I didn't want to go home yet. We crouched behind the living room couch for what felt like 5 or 10 minutes, but no one ever came inside. Our curiosity finally got the better of us, and we cautiously stepped out onto the front porch where Lucy was standing. We asked her where our mothers were, and she looked utterly confused. "No one was here," she said, her brow furrowed. Lucy seemed pretty freaked out, I guess, because the three of us stayed outside together for the rest of the day until our actual moms finally arrived. Over the years, I've encountered quite a few strange occurrences, but this one still gives me the chills. It was summertime and my mom, older sister, and I were visiting my dad in Maryland. I was probably in elementary school at the time. Near where we were staying, there was this small, abandoned house. Naturally, my sister, her new friend, and I thought it would be cool to explore. It was definitely a mix of cool, creepy, and seriously dirty. For some reason, I was the only one who decided to take a souvenir. I picked up a book about aircraft and a small, brightly colored plastic action figure. Ultimately, I chose to bring the toy home with me, leaving the book behind. I can't really explain why. It just felt like the right thing to do. Back home, I put the action figure on my shelf and pretty much forgot about it. It just sat there for years and nothing particularly strange happened. Fast forward to my high school days. I was cleaning out my room and rediscovered the toy. By then, I was well past playing with action figures, so I decided to throw it away. I distinctly remember taking the trash out that night myself, so I know it went into the bin. That's when things started to get weird. A couple of days later, I saw that same action figure sitting in my room, as if I'd never thrown it away. It really freaked me out because all the other paranormal things I'd ever experienced were visual apparitions, not physical objects seemingly moving on their own. I swear, I absolutely threw that toy away. And who in my family would have even remembered I had it, let alone dig through the trash to put it back in my room? It was just so incredibly creepy. Lately, being unemployed has been weighing on me, and I'm not someone who leans on religion for comfort. Last night, the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming against the windows and keeping me awake. Half jokingly, a thought popped into my head about how I should sell my soul for a good job that won't completely upend my home life. Almost immediately after that absurd thought, I mentally scoffed at myself, thinking, that's not how it works. I'd probably have to do some kind of ritual or something. Then, this sudden urge came over me to double-check all the doors to make sure they were locked. When I got to our apartment's patio door, I noticed something strange. It looked like a face had been pressed against the glass. Now, logically, I know it was probably just the way the condensation had formed, maybe the humidity playing tricks on my eyes, but after that whole selling my soul internal monologue, it felt like a really odd coincidence. And no, in my slightly weirded out state, taking a picture didn't even cross my mind. A few years back, I lived in the heart of Indiana's corn country. My place was pretty isolated. The only other building for miles in any direction was the farmhouse that belonged to the farmer who owned all the surrounding fields. One evening, around dusk, I was out on my back porch grilling some food, and as I looked out across the freshly plowed field, I spotted a small group of what I assumed were coyotes. Seeing coyotes wasn't unusual out there, and they generally kept their distance, so I wasn't particularly worried. Later that night, around 10:30 p.m., I was putting the grill away when I saw the same small group of coyotes again, this time much closer to my house. There were maybe 4 or 5 of them, and they were all standing upright on their hind legs in a circle facing each other. In the center of their circle was another coyote standing on all 4 legs. My back porch light was quite bright, so even though they were about 40 to 50 feet away, the scene was pretty clear. I stood there, watching for maybe 30 seconds. They just remained standing, unsupported by any fence or anything else. Then, as suddenly as they had stood up, they all dropped back down onto 4 legs and trotted off in a straight line toward the edge of the trees. A few years ago, while on a business trip, I found myself in a hotel in Isfahan, Iran. One afternoon, I happened to glance out the window. High above the distant mountains, against the clear, bright blue sky, there was an object that appeared to be descending towards Earth. What caught my attention was a distinct jet trail extending from one end of it, pointing upwards rather than downwards. I watched it intently for several minutes, and during that time, the object didn't seem to move at all. It remained in a completely fixed position. To this day, I have absolutely no idea what it could have been. It didn't resemble any airplane or balloon I've ever seen. What kind of object can be visible in broad daylight, leave a vapor trail that goes upwards, not downwards, and remain perfectly still in the sky for several minutes? The mystery of it still puzzles me. My freshman year of college, I was assigned to one of the older dorms on campus. For almost the entire year I lived there, a strange thing would happen every night as I settled down to sleep. About 10 minutes after I'd lie down, while I was still wide awake, I would distinctly feel the sensation of cat paws gently walking up and down my legs and across my back. Having grown up with cats, it was a very familiar and specific feeling. This would continue for about 30 seconds before simply disappearing. I was stretched out on the sofa in the main hall, completely absorbed in the television. It was around 8:30 in the evening, and I was the only one home. Suddenly, I heard loud snoring coming from my parents' bedroom, the kind of booming snores my dad produces that could probably rattle the windows next door. I sat up, muted the TV, and just listened. It was definitely happening. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. A mix of excitement and a little bit of fear bubbled up inside me. This was the first time I'd ever experienced anything that felt remotely paranormal. I stood up, gave myself a mental pep talk, and started walking towards the bedroom. As I approached, the snoring grew louder and louder. Just as I reached the open bedroom door, I did a little jump, ready to say, "Aha, gotcha," but the snoring stopped instantly, cutting off mid-snore. I stood there, scratching my head, looking around the silent room. There was nothing to see, nothing to hear. I went back to the sofa, sat down, and waited, listening intently for another half hour. Nothing. So, I shrugged it off and went back to watching TV. When I was around 12, my family was driving down I-5 North in California, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, just as the sun was setting. I was pretty sure I wasn't asleep because I was deep into a part of my book, and I always thought it was odd that no one else in the car ever stayed awake to help my dad with driving. I finished a chapter and glanced out the window to give my eyes a break. About 40 yards ahead, I saw a cross by the side of the road and a woman in a black lace dress and veil, kneeling and praying in front of it. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was just a trick of the light from the setting sun, but when I looked again, she was still there. As we got closer, I could see her more clearly. She looked up at the car, almost annoyed by the disturbance, and then walked off into the desert. The strange part? There was nothing around for miles. No buildings, no parking lots, no gas stations. Just endless desert. And this woman was standing there in a heavy black dress, in the middle of it all. Everyone else in the car was asleep, and my dad insists he didn't see anything. Maybe I was just dreaming, but I still believe I saw something. It was the middle of winter around 4 a.m. with at least 30 inches of snow on the ground. Not on the road, though. My friend and I were driving back from casino, heading toward Virginia, Minnesota, just north of Cloquet. We were about 4 car lengths behind a pickup truck and gaining on it, so I decided to switch lanes. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something moving. I looked just in time to see what can only be described as some sort of bipedal figure running full speed across the road, right in front of the truck. It darted into the right-of-way and then disappeared into the forest. The truck slammed on its brakes, and I did the same. My friend and I looked at each other in complete shock, barely able to process what we had just seen. We crept past the truck, too scared to stop because we both knew we had witnessed something extraordinary. The truck driver looked like he'd seen a ghost. He was in complete shock, too. We sped off as fast as we could, trying to wrap our heads around what had just happened. A few miles down the road, we glanced at each other and simply asked, "Did we just see what we think we saw?" There was no doubt We both saw something less than 4 feet tall, impossibly sprinting on 2 legs through almost 3 feet of snow. We finally made it back to her place outside of Virginia, locked the doors and windows, but neither of us could sleep a wink that night. To this day, I regret not stopping to talk to the truck driver. He was a yard away from hitting whatever that thing was, and I wonder if he had a better glimpse of it than we did. Nope. Whatever it wasn't human. I'm convinced we saw a midget Bigfoot. When I was about 20, my grandmother passed away unexpectedly. We were very close. She raised me for most of my childhood, and we even shared a birthday. So when she passed, it hit me hard, and I was understandably devastated. About a week after her memorial, I went back to my childhood home to help my grandfather start sorting through some of her things: clothes, family photos, knickknacks, and the like. I was in a back room of the house, going through boxes while my grandfather was upstairs in their bedroom. At some point, the phone rang. This was almost 20 years ago, so it was a landline, and there was only one phone in the house, sitting in the central living room. Neither of us felt like picking it up, so we let the answering machine take the call. The greeting on the machine was my voice, since my grandparents couldn't figure out how to change it, and after the beep, the incoming message started. I was listening to the message to see who it was when I heard a voice I would recognize anywhere: my grandmother's voice. I froze. The message was clear as day. "My nickname, sweetie, are you there? Grandpa's name. Can you come here? I love you." Then the beep and the message ended. I don't think I've ever moved faster in my life. I rushed to the phone, staring at the machine in disbelief. I thought maybe I had imagined it, but just then, my grandfather came running down the stairs, looking equally shocked, on the verge of tears. We stood there for a moment, both processing what had just happened. The light on the answering machine was blinking, so my grandfather pushed the button to play back the message. There was nothing. No voice. No static. Just a few seconds of silence, and then the machine announced, "No messages." We looked at each other, both of us in complete shock. My grandfather, still visibly shaken, said, "I guess it was an old one we forgot to erase," and he went back upstairs. Maybe it was just a glitch in the machine, or maybe it was all in my head. But I know what I heard, and I wasn't the only one who heard it. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you in the next video.